Welcome to this recollection of one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of the Smoky Mountains. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments from where you're watching and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know how far and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The year was 1850. The United States stood divided by the question of slavery, with the Fugitive Slave Act of that same year creating even deeper rifts between North and South. In the shadow of the Great Smoky Mountains, at the border between Tennessee and North Carolina, a story unfolded that few have heard but many should remember. The mountains had long been a contradictory place. While the eastern Tennessee region housed fewer enslaved people than the plantation-rich western parts of the state, slavery still existed here, primarily in the form of small holdings of 1 or 2 slaves per owner. The area was also known for its rugged terrain, which made it both an ideal hiding place for those fleeing bondage and a treacherous hunting ground for those who made their living capturing human beings. In these mountains lived a man named Caleb Turner. Unlike many in the region, Turner was not a poor white farmer, but a formerly enslaved man who had obtained his freedom through means that were not clearly documented in any of the records that survived. Some accounts suggest he had purchased his freedom after years of hiring out his own labor during the limited times his former master allowed him to do so. Others claim a sympathetic owner had granted him liberty on his deathbed. Whatever the truth, by 1850, Caleb Turner lived as a free man in a small cabin deep in the mountains, approximately 15 miles from what is now Gatlinburg. Turner kept to himself, as any black man living freely in a slave state would be wise to do. He survived through hunting, trapping, and occasionally trading pelts at remote outposts where the storekeepers either didn't question his status or had known him long enough not to care. His cabin, though humble, was situated near a spring that provided fresh water year-round. Positioned on a ridge that gave views of approaching visitors from considerable distance, it also featured several hidden exits and was conveniently located near what locals called the Devil's Maze, a network of caves that few dared to explore. What few knew was that Turner's isolated existence served a greater purpose. His cabin was one of the most remote stations of what would later become known as the Underground Railroad, that invisible network helping those escaping slavery find their way north to freedom. While most documented cases of this network existed in urban areas or closer to the Ohio River, some routes went through the mountains where the terrain itself provided protection against pursuit. In the autumn of 1850, word had reached Turner through the cautious whispers that constituted the Underground Railroad's communication system that 3 fugitives would be arriving at his cabin. They had escaped from a plantation in northern Georgia and were making their way toward Kentucky, where they hoped to cross the Ohio River into free territory. They were a family, a father, mother, and their 10-year-old son, who had fled after learning the plantation owner planned to sell their child to settle gambling debts. Turner prepared his cabin for their arrival, arranging the hidden space beneath his floorboards where fugitives could hide if slave catchers appeared. He gathered extra provisions, smoked venison, cornmeal, and dried berries. What he didn't realize was that someone had been watching his cabin for weeks. Nathan Briggs was what locals called a slave hunter, though he preferred the term property recovery agent. He was not from the mountains originally, having come from the Mississippi Delta, where he had worked as an overseer on a cotton plantation. After a falling out with the plantation owner, rumored to involve embezzlement and a particularly brutal punishment that resulted in the death of an enslaved man, Briggs had made his way east, discovering a lucrative opportunity in the business of retrieving fugitive slaves. The recent passage of the Fugitive Slave Act had been a boon for men like Briggs. The new law imposed harsh penalties on officials who refused to arrest suspected fugitive slaves and mandated fines for anyone who aided in their escape. More significantly for Briggs, it increased the rewards for capturing those who fled. With his knowledge of how to track humans from his overseer days and a cruel disposition that found satisfaction in the hunt, Briggs had established himself as one of the most successful slave catchers in the region. Briggs was not a lone operator. He employed a small gang of men, mostly impoverished whites with little education and fewer prospects, to assist in his operations. They would spread out across counties, gathering information about unusual movements or strangers passing through. Briggs had cultivated informants in towns and trading posts throughout eastern Tennessee and western North Carolina, offering rewards for information about suspicious black individuals traveling without proper documentation. It was one such informant, a trader at a small outpost about 7 miles from Turner's cabin, who had mentioned seeing Turner purchase more supplies than usual. The trader had thought nothing of it until Briggs had shown him a handbill describing 3 fugitives from Georgia with a substantial reward for their capture. The pattern matched what the trader had seen before, Turner stocking up just before visitors would arrive at his remote cabin. On the night of October 17th, 1850, as a half-moon illuminated the forest canopy, the family from Georgia, Thomas, Sarah, and young James Williams, arrived at Turner's cabin. They were exhausted, having traveled mostly by night for over 2 weeks, hiding in thickets and ravines during daylight hours. Turner welcomed them inside, offering food and water and explaining the route they would take northward the following night. Thomas Williams was a skilled craftsman who had worked as a carpenter on the plantation. His wife Sarah had been a house servant, which had given her access to information about the roads and towns they would need to traverse. Their son James was quiet and observant, his eyes reflecting a wisdom beyond his years, the kind that comes from being born into bondage and understanding the precarious nature of one's existence before being old enough to articulate it. As the family ate the simple meal Turner had prepared, Sarah recounted their journey. They had nearly been caught twice, once when a patrol had ridden within feet of the hollow log where they had hidden, and again when they had mistakenly approached a farm where the owner was known to collaborate with slave catchers. Each time, a combination of luck and the spiritual guidance Sarah firmly believed was directing their path had kept them safe. Turner explained that they would rest for 2 days before continuing northward. He had contacts farther up in the mountains who would guide them toward Kentucky. From there, they would need to find a way across the Ohio River, which represented the boundary between enslavement and the possibility of freedom, though even that had become more dangerous with the new Fugitive Slave Act. Even in the free states, you must be cautious, Turner warned. The new law means they can take you back even from Ohio or Pennsylvania. Canada is the only true safety. Thomas nodded grimly. We heard. That's why we're heading toward Cincinnati. There's people there who can help us get across to Canada. What none of them knew was that Nathan Briggs and 4 of his men were already making their way up the mountain toward Turner's cabin. The informant had sent word immediately after Turner's visit to the trading post, and Briggs had gathered his crew within hours. They had camped at the base of the mountain that night and began their ascent at first light, moving slowly and deliberately to avoid detection. Briggs was not merely interested in capturing the fugitives. He had heard rumors about Turner for months, a free black man living alone in the mountains, occasionally seen with strangers who would arrive at night and disappear days later. The bounty for the Williams family was substantial, but if he could prove Turner was aiding fugitive slaves, there would be an additional reward under the new law. Moreover, Briggs suspected Turner might lead them to others involved in the Underground Railroad network, potentially resulting in even greater profits. The morning of October 18th dawned clear and cold in the mountains. Inside the cabin, Turner and the Williams family ate a breakfast of cornmeal mush, sweetened with a small amount of precious maple sugar. Young James had slept soundly for the first time in weeks, feeling momentarily safe within the sturdy walls of the cabin. His parents, however, remained vigilant, startling at every sound from the surrounding forest. Turner had planned to show them the nearby cave system that day, a precaution in case they needed to hide quickly. The caves stretched for miles beneath the mountain, with numerous chambers and passages. Few locals ventured into them due to superstition and practical concerns about getting lost in the labyrinthine tunnels. But Turner had spent years mapping them mentally, learning which passages led where and which chambers provided the best shelter. As they prepared to leave the cabin, Turner suddenly froze. His years in the mountains had attuned his senses to the natural rhythms of the forest, and something felt wrong. The birds had gone silent in a pattern that suggested human movement rather than the presence of a natural predator. "Inside," he whispered urgently, "under the floor. Now." The family didn't question him. They had survived thus far by trusting those who were helping them and responding immediately to warnings. Turner quickly lifted the false section of floorboards, revealing a shallow space beneath. It was cramped and dark, but the Williams family climbed down without hesitation. Turner replaced the boards, ensuring they fitted perfectly with the surrounding floor, then scattered a thin layer of dirt over the seam to disguise it. He had barely finished when the first knock came at his door, loud, authoritative, and menacing in its confidence. "Open up in there," a voice called out. "We're looking for stolen property." Turner took a deep breath, composed his face into a mask of confused innocence, and opened the door. Before him stood Nathan Briggs, flanked by two rough-looking men with rifles. Two others circled toward the back of the cabin. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Turner asked, his voice steady, despite the fear gripping his chest. Briggs looked Turner up and down, his eyes cold and calculating. "You Caleb Turner?" "I am." "We're looking for 3 runaways from Georgia. Man, woman, and child. Reliable information says they were headed this way." Turner shook his head slowly. "Haven't seen anyone like that. Don't get many visitors up here at all." Briggs didn't respond immediately. Instead, he pushed past Turner into the cabin, his men following. They began searching immediately, opening the single cupboard, looking under the bed, checking the small root cellar accessible through a trap door in the corner. "You live alone, Turner?" Briggs asked, noting the 4 bowls on the table still containing remnants of breakfast. Turner's mind worked quickly. "I do. Was eating in shifts. 1 bowl for mush, 1 for some stewed rabbit, 1 for berries. And the 4th, Briggs asked, his eyebrow raised skeptically. "I collect maple sap. That one had some sugar I was sampling." Briggs seemed unconvinced but continued his search. The men were thorough, tapping walls for hollow spaces, checking the chimney, even lifting Turner's mattress. All the while, the Williams family remained silent beneath the floor, surely hearing every footstep and word exchanged above them. After nearly an hour of searching, Briggs's men had found nothing conclusive. There were signs that suggested recent visitors, extra blankets, more food than one man would need, but no definitive evidence of the fugitives they sought. Briggs, frustrated but not defeated, turned to Turner. "We're going to camp nearby for a few days. These mountains are perfect for hiding, but even the best hiding places get found eventually." It was a threat, plain and simple. Turner understood that Briggs suspected him, but lacked proof. The slave catcher was hoping that by maintaining a presence nearby, either Turner or the fugitives would make a mistake. After Briggs and his men left, Turner waited nearly an hour before lifting the floorboards. The Williams family emerged, stiff from being confined in the small space, but otherwise unharmed. "They're still out there," Turner whispered. "They'll be watching the cabin." Thomas Williams looked toward his wife and son, his face etched with worry. "What do we do now?" Turner considered their options. The cave system offered the best chance of escape, but reaching it would require crossing open ground that Briggs's men might be watching. Staying in the cabin was untenable. Sooner or later, Briggs would return with more men or find some pretext to search more thoroughly. "We wait until dark," Turner finally said. "There's a back way to the caves that few know about. It's longer and more difficult, but it might be our only chance." As the day progressed, the atmosphere in the cabin grew increasingly tense. Every sound from outside, a branch breaking, birds taking flight, caused them all to freeze in fearful anticipation. Young James remained remarkably composed, though his eyes revealed the terror he felt. Sarah prayed quietly, her lips moving in silent supplication for divine protection. Turner moved about the cabin normally, occasionally stepping outside to tend to routine tasks that would be expected of someone living alone. Each time, he carefully scanned the surrounding forest, noting the positions of Briggs's men. They had established 3 observation points around the cabin, effectively covering all obvious escape routes. As dusk approached, Turner prepared a simple meal, deliberately lighting lamps and moving around the cabin in ways visible from outside. His plan was to establish a pattern that Briggs's men would expect to continue into the night. When full darkness fell, Turner extinguished most of the lamps but left one burning near the window. In whispers, he instructed the Williams family on what would happen next. They would exit through a tunnel Turner had dug beneath the cabin's root cellar, a precaution he had established years earlier for precisely such situations. The tunnel emerged in a dense thicket about 50 yards behind the cabin. From there, they would need to move quietly through the underbrush until they reached a small stream that would lead them to one of the cave entrances. "Once inside the caves," Turner explained, "we follow the marked path, small stacks of 3 stones I've placed at each turning. It will lead us to another exit, nearly 2 miles from here, well beyond where Briggs and his men are searching." The plan was risky, but offered their best chance of escape. Turner gathered minimal provisions, some dried meat, a small pouch of cornmeal, a water skin, and a tinderbox for making fire. Too many supplies would slow them down, and Turner knew the mountains well enough to survive with little. They waited until nearly midnight, when Turner judged that the watchers might be at their least alert. One by one, they descended into the root cellar and then into the narrow tunnel beneath it. Turner went first, then young James, followed by Sarah, with Thomas bringing up the rear. The tunnel was tight and earthen, requiring them to crawl on hands and knees through the damp soil. It seemed to stretch endlessly in the absolute darkness, the only sound their labored breathing and the occasional scrape of fabric against dirt. Finally, Turner reached the exit, carefully pushing aside the covering of branches and leaves he had arranged to conceal it. He emerged into the night air, scanning for any sign of Briggs's men before signaling the others to follow. Young James came next, his small frame slipping easily through the opening. Sarah followed, her dress now caked with soil from the tunnel. Thomas, larger than the others, struggled briefly before freeing himself from the narrow passage. Together they crouched in the thicket, listening intently for any sound that might indicate they had been discovered. The forest was quiet, except for the natural noises of night creatures, the distant hoot of an owl, the chirping of crickets, the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. Turner pointed silently toward a barely discernible path leading away from the cabin. They began to move, stepping carefully to avoid dry branches that might snap underfoot. Every few yards they would pause to listen again, the tension making minutes feel like hours. They had covered perhaps a quarter mile when a shout came from the direction of the cabin. Briggs or one of his men had apparently decided to check on Turner and discovered his absence. Soon the sound of men crashing through the forest echoed behind them. "Run!" Turner whispered urgently. "Follow the stream bed when you reach it. I'll divert them." Thomas began to protest, but Turner cut him off. "There's no time. Your family needs you. I know these mountains better than they do." Before they could argue further, Turner darted off in a direction perpendicular to their escape route, deliberately making enough noise to attract attention. The Williams family hesitated only briefly before continuing toward the stream, their pace quickened by the sounds of pursuit growing louder behind them. Turner led Briggs and his men on a circuitous chase through the forest, using his knowledge of the terrain to stay just ahead of them, while leading them steadily away from the Williams family's route. He ducked under low-hanging branches, splashed through shallow pools to mask his trail, and occasionally doubled back to confuse his pursuers. After nearly an hour of this deadly game, Turner circled back toward the cave entrance, where he hoped to find the Williams family waiting. But as he approached, a searing pain tore through his leg. One of Briggs's men, having anticipated his route, had laid in wait and fired his rifle from close range. Turner fell, clutching his wounded thigh as blood seeped between his fingers. Within minutes, Briggs and the rest of his men converged on the spot. Turner was dragged roughly to his feet, a coil of rope already being prepared to bind his hands. "Where are they, Turner?" Briggs demanded, his face twisted with anger and exertion from the chase. Turner remained silent, his eyes fixed on the distant mountains, silhouetted against the night sky. Briggs struck him across the face. "The law's clear on this. Aiding fugitive slaves is a federal offense now. You're looking at years in prison, if not worse. Tell me where they went, and maybe I can convince the judge to be lenient." Still, Turner said nothing. Briggs signaled to his men, who forced Turner to his knees, despite his wounded leg. The pain was excruciating, but Turner's expression remained defiant. "Have it your way," Briggs growled. "We'll find them with or without your help. These mountains can't hide them forever." Turner was bound and taken back to his cabin, where one of Briggs's men crudely bandaged his leg to keep him from bleeding to death before they could deliver him to the authorities. They wanted him alive, both for the reward and for the information he might eventually provide. By dawn, Briggs had organized a more extensive search. Word had been sent to nearby settlements for additional men, and by midday, nearly 20 searchers were combing the mountains for the Williams family. Dogs were brought in to follow their scent, and riders were dispatched to watch the most likely routes northward. What Briggs didn't know, what Turner had counted on, was the complexity of the cave system beneath the mountains. The Williams family had indeed found the entrance Turner had described, and followed his markers through the winding passages. The cave's muffled sound and confused the dogs, making tracking nearly impossible. Moreover, the multiple exits allowed for numerous possible emergence points, spreading Briggs's resources thin as they attempted to cover them all. For 3 days, the search continued with increasing frustration on Briggs's part. His reputation as a slave catcher was at stake, along with the substantial reward for capturing the Williams family. The local sheriff had taken custody of Turner, holding him in a makeshift cell in the nearest town while awaiting a judge to hear the case against him for violating the Fugitive Slave Act. Turner's wound had become infected, and fever racked his body. Without proper medical care, it seemed unlikely he would survive to stand trial. This concerned the sheriff, who worried about losing the potential testimony that might lead to dismantling more of the Underground Railroad network. On the 4th day of the search, one of Briggs's men discovered what appeared to be recent footprints near a stream about 5 miles north of Turner's cabin. The tracks suggested 3 people, a man, a woman, and a child, moving quickly but carefully along the water's edge. Briggs immediately redirected his efforts toward this promising lead, convinced they were closing in on their quarry. What followed was a day of intense pursuit, with Briggs and his men following the trail northward. The footprints occasionally disappeared, suggesting the fugitives had walked in the stream to hide their tracks, but always reappeared further along. By nightfall, Briggs was certain they were less than an hour behind the Williams family. The pursuers made camp, planning to resume at first light when tracking would be easier. Briggs went to sleep confident that the next day would bring success and vindication. He awoke to find 2 of his men missing and their weapons gone. More disturbing, the tracks they had been following now appeared to double back on themselves in ways that made no logical sense. It was as if the fugitives had deliberately walked in circles, creating a confusing pattern before vanishing. What Briggs didn't realize was that he had fallen victim to a trap, one set not by Turner alone, but by a network of mountain people who had their own reasons to oppose slave catchers. Some were abolitionists on principle, others simply resented outsiders, bringing their conflicts into the mountains. A few were free black families living in isolated hollows who maintained their own invisible connections for mutual protection. The missing men had not deserted or been harmed. They had been lured away with false information about the fugitives' whereabouts, then deliberately misled until they were hopelessly lost in the maze of ridges and valleys. The confusing tracks had been laid by local hunters who knew how to manipulate signs in the forest to confuse and misdirect. By the time Briggs understood what had happened, nearly a week had passed since the Williams family had escaped from Turner's cabin. The trail was cold, his men were demoralized, and supplies were running low. Reluctantly, he called off the search, returning to town to report his failure to the plantation owner who had hired him. Turner, meanwhile, had taken a turn for the worse. The infection in his leg had spread, and he drifted in and out of consciousness in his cell. The local doctor, summoned by the sheriff, had limited resources and little incentive to provide his best care to a black man accused of aiding fugitive slaves. He cleaned the wound and administered what medicines he had available, but offered little hope for Turner's recovery. What happened next would become the subject of conflicting accounts for decades afterward. According to the sheriff's official report, Turner died of his wound during the night of November 2nd, 1850. His body was buried in an unmarked grave behind the jailhouse, as was customary for prisoners who died in custody. But stories persisted among the mountain communities of a different outcome. These accounts claimed that a group of local abolitionists, including a prominent Quaker family and several free blacks, had bribed the jailer to look the other way while they rescued Turner from his cell. They supposedly took him to a remote homestead where he was nursed back to health over several months. Once recovered, these stories suggest Turner made his way north to Pennsylvania or possibly Canada, where he continued his work with the Underground Railroad under a different name. As for the Williams family, their fate remained uncertain for many years. No definitive record of their capture exists, suggesting they likely escaped Briggs and his men. Some accounts from Underground Railroad conductors in Ohio mentioned a family, matching their description, arriving in Cincinnati in late December of 1850, having traveled a circuitous route through the mountains of eastern Kentucky. From there, they presumably continued to Canada, as thousands of other fugitives did during this period. Nathan Briggs's failure to capture the Williams family damaged his reputation as a slave catcher. He attempted to rebuild his standing by taking on other cases, but his methods grew increasingly brutal as frustration and financial pressure mounted. In 1853, he was implicated in the death of a free black man whom he had mistakenly identified as a fugitive slave. Though never formally charged due to the prejudices of the legal system at the time, the incident further tarnished his reputation. By 1856, Briggs had abandoned slave catching and returned to Mississippi, where he found work as an overseer on a plantation smaller and less prestigious than the one he had left years earlier. When the Civil War erupted in 1861, he joined the Confederate Army, serving in a Mississippi infantry regiment. He was killed at the Battle of Shiloh in April 1862. The story of Caleb Turner and the Williams family might have been lost to history entirely if not for a collection of letters discovered in 1964 during the renovation of an old Quaker meeting house near Friendsville, Tennessee. Hidden in a concealed compartment beneath the floorboards, the letters included correspondence between abolitionists in Tennessee, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. Several mentioned Turner by name and described his work helping fugitive slaves through the mountains. One letter, dated January 1851, made specific reference to the family T helped last autumn, who escaped the clutches of the notorious B through the caves. This tantalizing fragment suggests that at least part of the oral tradition about Turner and the Williams family had a basis in fact. Archaeological investigations conducted in the 1980s identified what is believed to be Turner's cabin site, though little remained beyond the stone foundation and some scattered artifacts. More significant was the discovery of the cave system nearby, with passages that indeed connected to exits miles apart, just as described in the folk accounts. Researchers found small stacks of stones at various junctions within the caves, possible remnants of the markers Turner supposedly used to guide escapees through the darkness. Perhaps most intriguing was a discovery made in 1968 in a small black cemetery in southern Ontario. Among the weathered gravestones was one marking the resting place of Thomas Williams, who died in 1882 at the age of 67. The inscription noted that he was born in bondage, lived in freedom, and mentioned his wife Sarah and son James as survivors. While it cannot be proven with absolute certainty that this was the same Williams family who fled through the Smoky Mountains in 1850, the coincidence of names and circumstances is striking. The case of Caleb Turner and the Williams family represents just one of countless stories of resistance against the institution of slavery. For every documented escape along the Underground Railroad, many more went unrecorded, lost to history except in fragmentary oral traditions and occasional archival discoveries. The mountains of eastern Tennessee, with their rugged terrain and networks of caves, played a role in these escapes that has only recently begun to receive scholarly attention. Today, historians estimate that hundreds, perhaps thousands, of enslaved people attempted to escape through the Appalachian Mountains in the decades before the Civil War. Many were recaptured or perished in the attempt, but some, like the Williams family, apparently succeeded in reaching freedom. Their journeys were made possible by people like Caleb Turner, who risked everything to help others achieve the liberty that should have been their birthright. The story also reminds us that history is rarely as simple as it first appears. The mountain communities of Appalachia contained individuals of widely varying views on slavery and race, from committed abolitionists to enthusiastic slave catchers like Briggs. The region defies easy categorization, with pockets of resistance existing alongside areas of strong support for the institution of slavery. As the nation continues to grapple with the long shadow cast by slavery and its aftermath, stories like that of Turner and the Williams family offer important perspectives on how ordinary people confronted the moral challenges of their time. Some chose complicity with an unjust system, others risked their lives to oppose it. In the choices they made, we can perhaps find lessons for confronting the moral challenges of our own era. In 1864, Congress repealed the Fugitive Slave Acts as the Civil War drew to a close. The following year, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery throughout the United States. For people like the Williams family, if they indeed reached Canada, these developments might have allowed them to consider returning to American soil, though many chose to remain in their adopted country, wary of the ongoing racial violence that characterized the Reconstruction era and beyond. The caves that once provided sanctuary to fugitives seeking freedom still wind beneath the Smoky Mountains. Modern hikers occasionally venture into their accessible portions, most unaware of the role these dark passages played in one of America's most morally consequential struggles. The mountains themselves stand as silent witnesses to countless untold stories of courage, desperation, cruelty, and hope. Perhaps somewhere in those mountains, in a hollow or on a ridge known only to locals, there remains some tangible connection to Turner and the Williams family. A carving on a tree, a stone marker, or simply the memory of their passage preserved in stories passed down through generations. For now, their journey exists in that shadowy space between documented history and legend, a reminder that the full story of America's past continues to emerge, one fragment at a time, from the darkness into light. In 1968, a doctoral student researching Appalachian oral histories recorded an interview with Elijah Jenkins, then 92 years old, whose grandfather had been a contemporary of Caleb Turner. The recording, preserved in the archives of the University of Tennessee, provides one of the most detailed accounts of what might have happened after Turner's supposed death in custody. According to Jenkins, his grandfather claimed that Turner had indeed been rescued from the jail by a coalition of mountain abolitionists. They didn't just take him because they agreed with his cause, Jenkins recalled his grandfather saying. They took him because they hated Briggsmore. The man had been terrorizing these mountains for years, taking anyone with dark skin who couldn't produce papers fast enough, whether they were fugitives or free people who had lived here for generations. The rescue, as Jenkins told it, involved a deliberately set fire in a shed behind the jail, which drew away the single guard long enough for Turner to be removed from his cell. He was hidden in a false-bottomed wagon and transported to a remote cabin owned by a half-Cherokee healer known locally as Widow Blackburn. There, using poultices of local herbs and roots, she gradually brought Turner back from the brink of death, though his leg would never fully heal, leaving him with a permanent limp. Once recovered enough to travel, Turner was reportedly moved north through a series of safe houses until reaching Pennsylvania. Jenkins's account suggested that Turner eventually settled in a small community of free blacks near Pittsburgh, taking the name Isaiah Johnson and working as a carpenter. If true, this would align with census records from 1860 that show an Isaiah Johnson listed as a free person of color and carpenter living in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania. The census listed his age as 45, which would have matched Turner's approximate age at that time. Most intriguing in Jenkins's account was the claim that Turner continued his Underground Railroad activities from Pennsylvania, maintaining contact with his allies in the Smoky Mountains through carefully coded letters, ostensibly about timber prices and carpentry techniques. These communications allegedly helped dozens more enslaved people navigate the treacherous mountain routes to freedom in the decade before the Civil War. My grandfather said that Turner became something of a ghost story to the slave catchers, Jenkins recounted. They'd hear rumors that he was still operating in the mountains, but whenever they went looking, they'd find nothing but empty caves and cold trails. Some started to believe he wasn't even real, just a name people used to scare them. This folklore dimension of Turner's legacy points to another aspect of resistance against slavery, the power of stories themselves as weapons against oppression. Whether Turner actually survived to continue his work or died in that jail cell, the belief that he had escaped and remained active served to embolden others and demoralize those who sought to maintain the system of human bondage. In 1894, a memoir published by a former Underground Railroad conductor named Samuel Mitchell included a brief reference to a one-legged black man from the Tennessee mountains who guided more souls to freedom than any 10 others combined. Mitchell, who had operated primarily in Ohio, claimed to have met this man twice during the 1850s, describing him as quiet in demeanor but fierce in his commitment to liberty. While Mitchell did not name Turner explicitly, the description and timing align with Jenkins's account. The historical record regarding the Williams family is similarly fragmented but suggestive. Canadian census records from 1861 identify a Thomas and Sarah Williams living in a predominantly black settlement near Dresden, Ontario, with their son James, then 21. Thomas's occupation was listed as carpenter, the same skill he had practiced in bondage, and their ages match what would be expected for the family that fled through Turner's cabin. Titled simply, My Journey to Freedom, it described escaping slavery as a child with his parents, traveling through mountains that seemed to touch the very heavens, and hiding in caves that stretched endlessly beneath the earth. The account mentioned being guided by a man who had himself escaped the chains of bondage years earlier and evading hunters led by a cruel man known for his merciless pursuit of those seeking liberty. While the memoir did not name Turner or Briggs, specifically, the parallels are striking. More compelling is a brief memoir published in a black newspaper in Toronto in 1885, apparently written by James Williams. The most haunting element of James Williams's account was his description of the psychological impact of the journey. Even now, decades later, in a land of freedom, I sometimes wake in the night believing I hear the baying of hounds in pursuit, he wrote. The terror of those days never fully leaves one's soul. It becomes a shadow that follows even in the brightest sunlight of liberty. This psychological aftermath, what modern clinicians might identify as post-traumatic stress, was common among those who escaped slavery, a largely undocumented aspect of the Underground Railroad experience. The journey to freedom exacted costs that extended far beyond the physical hardships of the escape itself, creating wounds that often never fully healed even among those who successfully reached free soil. In 1976, archaeologists from the University of Tennessee conducted a limited excavation of what they believed to be the cave system Turner used to help fugitives escape. Deep within one of the chambers, scratched into a limestone wall, they discovered what appeared to be initials and a date, TWSWJW Oct. 1850. While impossible to verify conclusively, the timing and initials are consistent with Thomas, Sarah, and James Williams during their flight through the mountains. Nearby, another inscription read simply, CT guides all who seek freedom. The weathering patterns suggested it had been carved at approximately the same time. The discovery lent credence to at least some elements of the oral tradition surrounding Turner and the Williams family, though many questions remained unanswered. Perhaps most significant for understanding the broader context of their story was a collection of slave patrol records from counties surrounding the Great Smoky Mountains, compiled by historians in the early 2000s. These documents revealed a dramatic increase in patrols and slave hunter activity in the region following the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, suggesting that the mountains were indeed a significant route for those seeking freedom. The records also indicated that success rates for these patrols declined sharply in the mid-1850s, with numerous reports of disappearances and inexplicable losses of trail in the mountain regions. One frustrated patrol leader wrote to the governor of Tennessee in 1857, complaining that it appears the very mountains conspire against us, swallowing those we pursue into their depths without trace. This observation, while poetic in its frustration, contained a literal truth. The karst topography of the region, with its extensive cave systems and underground waterways, provided natural features that could be exploited by those with intimate knowledge of the terrain. Turner's strategic use of these geological formations represented an ingenious adaptation of the landscape itself as a tool of resistance. In 2005, ground-penetrating radar studies of the area around the former jail site identified what appeared to be several unmarked graves, consistent with the reported burial of prisoners who died in custody. County records authorized an archaeological investigation which recovered remains from one grave that might have been Turner's. Forensic analysis indicated the individual was a black male, approximately 40 years old, with evidence of a healed fracture in the femur consistent with a gunshot wound. However, subsequent DNA analysis complicated the identification. Researchers had located a woman in Philadelphia who, based on genealogical records, was believed to be a direct descendant of Turner's sister. Comparison of mitochondrial DNA from the remains with samples from this potential relative showed no match, suggesting either that the family connection was erroneous or that the remains were not those of Caleb Turner. This ambiguity feeds both possibilities: that Turner died and was buried at the jail as officially reported, or that the body buried there was someone else, potentially supporting the escape narrative. Historical truth remains as labyrinthine as the caves beneath the Smoky Mountains, with passages that sometimes lead to dead ends and others that open into unexpected chambers of possibility. The legacy of Turner and the Williams family extends beyond their individual experiences to illuminate broader patterns of resistance against slavery. Their story challenges simplistic narratives about the Underground Railroad as primarily a northern phenomenon, highlighting how resistance operated within slave states themselves, often in remote areas where geography provided natural advantages to those seeking freedom. It also reveals the complex social dynamics of Appalachian communities during this period. While much of the South is often portrayed as monolithically pro-slavery, the mountain regions contain diverse perspectives and allegiances. Economic marginalization meant many poor white mountaineers had little stake in the plantation system, while geographic isolation fostered a culture of independence that sometimes translated into resistance against external authorities, including slave catchers. The role of these mountain communities in undermining slavery remains underexplored in mainstream historical narratives. Recent scholarship suggests that the Appalachian region may have been home to dozens of individuals like Turner, operating in isolation or loose networks to guide fugitives through the mountain corridors to freedom. Their stories have been largely obscured, both by the necessary secrecy of their operations at the time and by subsequent historical focus on more documented routes further north. In 2010, a previously unknown diary was discovered during the renovation of an old home in Friendsville, Tennessee. Written by a Quaker woman named Rebecca Thornton between 1848 and 1853, it contained several coded references to what she called friends traveling north. One entry from November 1850 mentioned providing medical supplies to sea for the healing of one who guides many. While not mentioning Turner by name, the timing aligns with his reported rescue and recovery. Thornton's diary also recorded her impressions of the psychological toll taken on those who operated within the Underground Railroad network. "The weight of secrecy presses heavily upon the soul," she wrote in one entry. "Each creaking board at night might herald doom, each stranger's gaze might perceive our purpose. Yet what choice have we when confronted with the greater sin of allowing God's children to remain in chains?" This inner conflict between fear for one's own safety and moral imperative to act characterized many who opposed slavery from within slave-holding territories. For someone like Turner, a formerly enslaved person himself operating in a slave state, this risk was magnified exponentially. Discovery meant not just legal penalties but potentially re-enslavement or death. In the case of Nathan Briggs, we find the psychological counterpoint, a man whose identity and livelihood became inextricably linked to the maintenance of the slave system through violence and intimidation. County court records from eastern Tennessee included several complaints against Briggs for excessive brutality, even by the standards of the time. including an 1852 case where he severely beat a free black man while attempting to apprehend an unrelated fugitive slave. The judge in that case, while dismissing the charges, nevertheless noted that Briggs's zeal occasionally exceeds the bounds of necessity. This judicial understatement masked the reality of a man whose pursuit of fugitive slaves had become something beyond mere economic interest, a personal vendetta against those who challenged the system that gave him purpose and power. Briggs's obsession with capturing the Williams family and exposing Turner's operation suggests a man confronting not just a professional failure, but an existential threat. Each successful escape undermined not only the institution of slavery itself, but also his self-concept as an effective enforcer of that system. His increasingly erratic and violent behavior after failing to capture the Williams family points to this psychological unraveling. Local newspaper accounts from 1855 documented Briggs's arrest for public intoxication and disorderly conduct in a small town near the Kentucky border. According to witness statements, he had been ranting about ghosts in the mountains and devils in the caves who were stealing property from honest men. This incident occurred shortly after he had failed to capture another group of fugitive slaves who had reportedly disappeared into the mountain wilderness. By contrast, oral histories collected from descendants of the free black communities that existed in isolated pockets of the Smoky Mountains portray Turner as a figure of almost mythical calm and resourcefulness. One account, recorded in 1972 from Elizabeth Carter, then in her 90s, described her grandmother's recollection of Turner. She said he never seemed afraid, even when the slave catchers were within shouting distance. He moved through those mountains like he was part of them, like the trees and rocks themselves were helping him. This spiritual dimension appears repeatedly in accounts of Turner from the Black Mountain communities. Some described him as possessing supernatural abilities to communicate with animals or predict weather changes, attributions common in folk traditions, but perhaps also reflecting his deep knowledge of mountain ecosystems and weather patterns. Others suggested he knew old ways of moving without leaving tracks or making sound, knowledge possibly derived from Cherokee contacts in the region. These mythologizing elements, while frustrating to strict historical documentation, nonetheless capture an important truth. Turner and others like him operated at the boundaries of the possible, utilizing every available resource, natural, social, and spiritual, to undermine a system of oppression that seemed all-encompassing in its power. The seeming impossibility of their success against such odds naturally invited supernatural explanation. For the Williams family, the journey through Turner's underground network represented just the beginning of a lifelong negotiation with freedom and its meanings. If the Ontario records indeed refer to the same family, their eventual establishment as free persons in Canada came with its own challenges. While Canada had abolished slavery decades earlier, black communities there still faced discrimination, economic marginalization, and the psychological legacy of bondage. James Williams's memoir hinted at these ongoing struggles. "Freedom is not merely the absence of chains," he wrote, "it is the presence of possibility." He described the difficulty of adjusting to life as a legally free person after having been defined from birth as property. "One does not simply become free upon crossing a border," he observed. "The spirit must learn freedom as a child learns to walk, with many stumbles along the way." This insight reflects a deeper truth often absent from triumphalist narratives of escape, that the Underground Railroad delivered people not to an idealized promised land, but to the beginning of a different and still challenging journey. The psychological chains of slavery often persisted long after the physical ones were broken. The story of the Williams family's escape through Turner's mountain network represents just one thread in the vast tapestry of resistance against slavery. For every documented case, countless others remain buried in unmarked graves, lost in forgotten archives, or preserved only in family stories passed down through generations. The full scope of the Underground Railroad, particularly its southern operations in places like the Smoky Mountains, may never be fully documented. Yet the fragments that survive paint a compelling picture of courage, ingenuity, and moral clarity amid one of America's darkest periods. Turner's use of the mountain landscape as both hiding place and escape route demonstrates how resistance often emerges from intimate knowledge of place, knowledge born of necessity and turned toward liberation. The caves that once sheltered the Williams family during their flight to freedom are now popular tourist attractions, with guides who rarely mention their historical significance in the struggle against slavery. The forests that concealed both fugitives and pursuers have been largely preserved within the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, their secrets hidden beneath layers of leaves accumulated over centuries. Occasionally, hikers on remote trails report finding what appear to be ancient stone markers, 3 small rocks stacked deliberately at junctions where paths diverge. Park rangers generally attribute these to modern visitors, but locals sometimes exchange knowing glances, wondering if some might date back to Turner's time, remnants of a code that once guided desperate travelers toward freedom. In 2015, during an unusually dry summer, a recreational cave explorer photographed what appeared to be a carving, deep within a rarely visited passage of the cave system near Turner's cabin site. Partially obscured by mineral deposits, the markings seemed to include the words "Follow North Star," with a crude arrow pointing toward what would have been the northern exit of the cave system. Dating such carvings is notoriously difficult, but geological experts, consulted by the Park Service, estimated it could be consistent with the mid-19th century. Whether this marking was created by Turner himself, the Williams family, or other fugitives who passed through these underground passages may never be known with certainty. Like much of this history, it exists in that liminal space between verifiable fact and plausible possibility, challenging us to consider how we determine historical truth when conventional documentation was deliberately avoided or subsequently destroyed. The story of Caleb Turner and the Williams family reminds us that history often unfolds in the shadows, in remote mountain hollows, underground passages, and quiet acts of conscience that leave few traces in official records. It suggests that our understanding of the past will always remain incomplete, with voices silenced not just by oppression, but by the necessary secrecy of resistance against it. Yet even in this incompleteness, patterns emerge that illuminate larger truths. The geography of the Smoky Mountains, with its caves and ridges and hidden valleys, became not just the setting, but an active participant in these struggles for freedom. The social networks of mountain communities, often stereotyped as isolated and provincial, revealed themselves capable of sophisticated cooperation across racial and class lines when moral imperatives demanded it. Above all, the story reveals individual human beings making profound choices in impossible circumstances. Turner risking his hard-won freedom to help others achieve theirs, the Williams family entrusting their lives to strangers and the darkness of unknown caves, even Briggs choosing to dedicate his life to the maintenance of a system fundamentally built on human suffering. In these choices, made in remote corners of the American wilderness nearly 2 centuries ago, we can perhaps find reflections of our own moral challenges. The questions they confronted, about complicity and resistance, about what we owe to one another across the artificial boundaries of race and status, about the lengths to which we will go to uphold our deepest values, remain urgently present. The mountains stand silent now, the caves dark except for occasional research expeditions or tourist excursions. The descendants of those who participated in these events as fugitives, guides, or pursuers may walk past each other in modern towns without knowing their shared history. The physical traces grow fainter with each passing decade as weather erodes markings and time claims the last who heard these stories directly from those who witnessed them. Yet something persists, carried forward in fragments of documents, in oral histories recorded before their bearers passed away, in the physical landscape itself for those who know how to read it. The story of Turner and the Williams family, with all its gaps and uncertainties, reminds us that freedom has always required those willing to guide others through darkness towards something better, often at tremendous personal risk. Each generation must find its own way through whatever wilderness stands before it, guided by the light of those who traveled before. In the Smoky Mountains today, when fog settles into the valleys at dusk and the ancient ridges become silhouettes against the darkening sky, it's not difficult to imagine Turner moving silently through the forest, mapping escape routes, or the Williams family huddled in a cave mouth, watching for the signal that would guide them to their next hiding place. Perhaps that, ultimately, is their most important legacy, not just what they did in their time, but what they might inspire in ours. As James Williams wrote in the conclusion of his brief memoir, "The path to freedom is never truly finished." Their physical presence has long since passed into history, but the moral example of their courage continues to echo through these mountains for those willing to listen.